Yo, everyone, my name's Phil. This will probably just be a rambling, but it'll be, I feel, a good ramble. I want to just give a show and tell of the cat team moving to Redux Toolkit from the Context API. Mostly at my findings and the differences between these two things. So as those two things might state, this is a very Redux heavy one. So React one even. So really focusing just on the differences between these two state management systems. So I'll try to be as descriptive as possible, but please let me know if I'm not making sense or rambling in two different areas. So yeah, few things to cover, but the great thing is most of it will be just pitches and show and tell. So that's cool. So when we started with the sales order page, we started with the Context API. The Context API is built into React, so that was good. And when we started, we didn't have much experience in React or any state management system. And one of the big things I wanted to do was try to lower the entry barrier, because starting with React was hard enough. And then if we wanted to use something like Redux, that was just two things of just complexity that we thought was unnecessary. And there was the option of using the Context API. And it is very useful for small scale projects, small scale applications. So it made a lot of sense to start with this. And that's definitely what the page was. It was very small scale in state and was very cool to get up and started with. And we were able to iterate very quickly with it, and that was awesome. But the page has definitely got a lot more complex, has a lot more features going into it. So right now, we're definitely adding a lot more complexity to our state, such as custom filters and bulk actions. And so because of this complexity expanding, we need to move away from the Context API. It was very easy to use at the start, but now that our state is growing, we're starting to break at the seams. Not very obvious, but it was definitely starting. And if we didn't do it now, it would have been a lot harder further on. So some things that were definitely issues that I was finding was there wasn't a standard way to do async actions. In Redux, you have middleware as thunk, and we'll get into that a bit when we get into Redux. But there definitely isn't a standard flow in Context. We tried to do the standard Flux flow where you dispatch an action and the action passes to a reducer, which update the store. But you don't have to do that with the Context API. And so I don't like that you didn't have standards. It's very hard to debug state, that's for sure. There isn't any like dev tools with Context API. So there was a lot of console logging, especially like trying to figure out like which action just actually got dispatched, what the current state is. All that is like console logging, and that's just not good. That's bad. And something I was finding, it was just like it's a bit of a silo of knowledge. So both Kraken and Ivy use Redux, and it was a little bad that we weren't. And like it's not necessary for micro UIs to all use Redux. That's definitely not the case. But if we use Redux, then we're all using it, and that makes it a little bit easier for devs to communicate onto different teams. And I've definitely had that with Jake. Like Jake and I have been having chats now that we both use Redux Toolkit. He's helped me immensely. I've helped him a little times here and there. So using the same thing has helped cross teams. So Redux Toolkit, I think Jake already did a little bit of a chat on like what Toolkit is, but just a little refresher. It is intended to be the standard way to write Redux logic now. And there was a few reasons that it was made and to be built on top of Redux. And these are reasons also why we didn't really want to do Redux initially. So configuring a Redux store is too complicated. It definitely is at the start. There's just a few little parts here and there. You have to add a lot of packages to get Redux to do anything useful. It's kind of true. You have to add a few middlewares to make it a little bit more useful. So things like Thunk, which adds async actions, and DevTools, so you can actually see what's happening in the browser on your state side. And Redux requires too much boilerplate code. That's also true. You have to set up quite a few things just to get up and running started. So you have like your store, you have your actions, you have your constants, you have your reducers, and then you have to hook it all up. The great thing about Redux Toolkit, a lot of this is hidden away, and it's very easy to get start and running. So just another beautiful thing is documentation. So not only do you have the Redux documentation, which is huge and awesome and maintained a lot, Redux Toolkit has great documentation. So this is just their website. As I said, it's the official way. You can see old mate Dan gives us the approval, but it has great documentation on how to use it, good tutorials, using it, API referencing. If we compare that to the context API, it has a one-pager talking about the API, some examples, very low-level examples, and that's all you get. Why? Because, well, first, this is documentation just on React, and this is just talking about the context part of it. And there's no real other documentation unless you start going on official, so you have blog posts, YouTube tutorials, which is cute, but it's developers, not the actual maintainers talking about it. It's like me right now talking about it. It's cute, but it's not the actual developers' documentation, so you can't get really into nitty-gritty about it. So yeah, a lot of positive reasons for Redux Toolkit. So now I'm just going to do a lot of show and tell of examples of the two differences. Yeah, hit out if they don't make sense. So here's two examples of like how to connect the actual React component to Redux. If you wanted your component to get some state, we'll use at the start, we'll look at the Redux part. You use selector, and what this does, you ask which pieces of the state you actually want. So like here, we want configs, filters, orders, and page status. And we use selector, and we say which slice that we care about. And I'll get into what slices are in a second. So here and then the component, it's just like using state or using props. You can say orders.id or whatever. You can just use that in your component. And then if you want to dispatch stuff, you have to just make sure in your component that you use dispatch, and then you can dispatch any actions that you get to. And I'll show that in a second as well. So in the context world, it might look simpler here. It's the only one case it looks simpler, but you would do a very simple thing where you use context, and use context is part of React. And then you connect that to the context provider, and it has, you destructure and you get elements out of that. So the state, where you do state.configs or state.filters, or you dispatch and you dispatch actions. So yeah. I noticed that I did all my images back to front. So all the context ones will be at the bottom, and then the Redux ones will be at the top. So we're going to go from bottom to top. But here's examples of how you connect your, I guess, whole application to the provider. In the bottom one, so we have the app router, where we just wrapped our listing page in a listing provider, and that's where we like set up the initial state. We do some fetches, and then we put a context provider wrapping around the children. And then you go into the middle part here, the Redux version. We have a provider that's a Redux thing, and we connect it to our store, and then we just wrap around our whole application. Doesn't really matter that we switched it around the router. Actually, it is good that we put it around the router this time, because you have slices when you have Redux, and you can just put it around your whole router. And if we had multiple pages, then that's okay. We don't need to change anything there. So that provider is connected to a store. And so if we go up, we see we have a variable store. And then we're starting to now using the toolkit, where you can configure your store. And there's a lot of things you can put in here, but what it needs is your reducers. And so we'll get into that in a second, but you can add in or remove middleware. So middleware is things that might happen while you're doing state changes, but things like Thunk and Dev Toolkit, Dev Tools, and then a few other things are default in Redux Toolkit. So you don't have to add those dependencies. It's already in the toolkit. But you can remove things. So like here, I'm getting the default ones, and I'm removing seriable check. Forgot exactly what that does, but we're removing it. Yeah, cool. So those that's the reducers, but that comes from this beautiful thing, our slice. So again, if you haven't really used Toolkit, this might be new. This is now a new standard way of doing all your reducers. In Redux land beforehand, you would have three major separate things. You would have your actions, you would have your constants, and then you have your reducers. And these are all different files that get quite large. And it was a little complex, a little annoying to do. But here we now have something called create slice, which comes from the toolkit. And it kind of scopes this whole slice into one area. You no longer have your constants, you no longer have your actions, it's here instead. And there's a reason for that, because here in our reducers, you can see like this update page status. It's just a function, and we're just basically saying page status equals payload. We'll get into that in a bit. Before, when you had to do it the old way in Redux, you never edit this your store, your state. That's a big no-no. The state is meant to be immutable. So you would always return a copy of the state plus your changes, whatever's happening with your action. But the beautiful thing about using Toolkit is it has under the hood something called imma. And so you can do this. You edit the state directly, but you're not technically doing that. And so you have a much simpler reducer because you don't have to return a copy anymore. You just edit whatever part of the state that you care about. So that update page status, we're literally saying whatever the payload is, change page status to that. Much simpler. And update pagination, it's updating three pieces of the state. We're saying if there's actually something in the payload, awesome, use that, or just keep it to whatever the current is, state, pagination, current. So that's really cool. This is a much cleaner way of doing it. And yeah, so then we're just exporting the actions and reducers. That reducers comes out of the slice, and the store that sales order reducer, that's exactly what that is. I'm just not using the correct import there, but that's exactly what we're adding to the store, which getting added to the provider. So nice. So now we're just getting into a few examples of like, okay, we have now, how do we dispatch it? So now it's very simple. In the component, you had to use dispatch, and here we just have a function that gets called whenever the component wants, and it's just dispatch actions expand row, and it gives it that. And so that's a very nice, elegant thing, because if we see an expand row, we're just basically saying what is it ever existingly in expand row, we're just adding that payload, so that additional ID. Previously, in the context API, because there was no real standard way, our actions, they had no access to existing state. So we had to make it so we would add in a prop, or add in a little thing here called prev state. So it had the previous state, and we could then combine it and then pass that to a reducer. So that's nice that we no longer have to do that because Redux has existing state. Here's another example. If we look at the bottom one first, again, context API didn't have access to dispatching additional actions. And so our request configs and request orders, these would be async actions. They would try to do some fetching, and then it would dispatch multiple actions, like page was successful, it might update pagination, and then update the orders. And so, yeah, we had to give it the dispatch function, which I wasn't really a fan of, and you had to give it pieces of state as that as well. So now in the top one, which is Redux, we just do fetch configs, fetch orders. You don't have to pass in all that dispatching, pass in the state, which is make it a lot more cleaner, a lot easier to read. So I'm very happy there. Cool. So this is just an example of like the life cycle in code of the Redux flow. So you might, in your component, do a dispatch the action of update page status, and you give it some payload. The slice will have a reducer, And so inside of that, it will be like, all right, the state page status will be the payload. And then for whatever reason, the table component might depend off it. So it will use selector and care about that piece of slice, and that page status then can get used. And it might have logic to be like, well, if it's loading, display a loader, but if it's page update, do something else. So that's really cool. That's the flow there. Here's a bit more of a complex one. So something I was saying is there's a middleware called Thunk. With this flow is technically synchronously. When you dispatch, it doesn't, there shouldn't be like any waiting or async material. That's not how the Redux world is. But if you do need async material, and that's definitely a standard thing, you can use something like this Thunk. So when we fetch orders, we want to hit the API, we want to get all the orders, and then we want to do a few things. And so this is the type of flow instead. Instead of having a reducer function, you would have this function, which is called create async thunk. So it has just a constant up here, which is its name, its fetch orders. And then it has the actual function, which we don't need to get too much into, but it would do, it's going to fetch all, it's going to get all those beautiful orders, and then it's going to return those orders. And so how this works with the slice, though, Toolkit will dispatch different actions depending on what's happening with that create async thunk. So when we fetch the orders initially, it's going to be an async function. It's going to be in a pending state. So it's going to dispatch the fetch orders pending action. And that's really great because then we can change some state during that time period. So down at the bottom here, we have this additional section that is like when fetch orders pending is happening, we want to ensure the page status is loading. And that's cool. That abstracts it away from the actual fetch orders function. And when the fetch orders function has been fulfilled, so this return orders part has happened, we want to do something else. We want to change the orders to be that payload, and we want to ensure the page status is success. So it was really good. But if for whatever reason our API call, our fetch all fails, there was an error, that's cool. Toolkit will be smart enough to be like, there was an error, and we want to do the rejected one instead of the fulfilled action. And that's cool because we can then change the page status to error, and if there's an error message, we can get that message and display it to the user maybe. So that's really cool because it abstracts all these, not side effects, but these additional things into their respective actions, and it keeps the fetch all thunk, the async material, as its own like subsection inside of its function. So yeah, a few things of the thunk is it has complete access to the existing state. So that first constant, we're just getting the thunk API, get state. And so sales orders will have access completely to the state. So in the fetch all, we're passing the pagination, the page size, the filters, all that gloriousness. But when the fetch all has been successful, we might want to dispatch more actions. So from a thunk, you can do more actions if necessary. So that's what we're doing here in the first then block. We're dispatching the update pagination to be whatever the headers say, because if we're on edible blooms, they might have whatever 4,000 orders. We just want to update the pagination to reflect that. So yeah, and then at the very bottom, it's just connecting to the orders as in the tables with use selector, because orders will now, after being fulfilled, it will have an array of all the orders. Cool. As you might have saw, though, those pending, fulfilled, and rejected, they're not in the reducer section, they're in the extra reducers. Extra reducers can do a lot of different things, but the main thing that we use it for is this, the thunk actions, where it has the 3 different states and where we change it. You don't have to have all of them. So like when we have fetch configs, we don't need a pending state. There's no reason for it. But we definitely add the fulfill and rejected because our components definitely need to know about that. So it's very cool. You can do it ad hoc, but very powerful material there. So cool, something I really wanted to show, and something that was one of the major reasons for using Toolkit, or just Redux in general, is it has dev tools. So before I was saying we use consoles. With Redux, you have access to Redux dev tools, and that's really awesome. And what does that do? It gives you a visualization of all the actions that have happened previously, and it gives you access of the state currently or in previous area. So you can see here we have all these actions that were happening, because I guess I've been on this page a bit. And it's great because it's scoped to our slice, so sales orders our slice, and yeah, it just gives you the names of all the different orders that happen. And it's cool because we can see from this one to this one what difference, what happened, and it gives you a visualization of like, okay, we remove the ID and show as false for whatever this is. So that's awesome. That's really cool. What's great is also you can go back in time and you can see your application when that part of the state was happening. So if you wanted to see what does your application look like in the pending state, it has this type of thing. So that's really awesome. You can see your application changing based on all your state changes. You can jump and all that on this. And yeah, really useful. Yeah, you can see the diff. You can see your state completely. So that's really awesome because you can see, well, why can't I see a particular order? Maybe it's not here or something. And it even has this chart, which I think is cool. It's not really useful, but it gives you a visualization of your complete state. And that was interesting because I thought, oh, wow, this is getting pretty large now, isn't it? But because DevTools is, I guess, any application, I can go to Jira or Bitbucket, and they use Redux as well. And we can see their type of state. And what I thought was large is nothing in comparison to this application. But they have a lot of different things. As you can see here, we have all these global source keyboards. I don't know what any of this does, but they use different slices to scope it to different things. So that's really cool. And it's just cool that I can go into their application and see their entire state. So I like that. And yeah, so this isn't restricted to just our page. If I went to any of the Amazon, not that page, because that's not a React page, but if I went to, I guess, the dashboard, I can now see some of Kraken's state as well. Hopefully it works. Yeah, so you can see they do a few things initially, and you have complete visualization of the difference between each action. Really awesome, really useful for debugging. That was the main thing. Oh yeah, this isn't really part of Redux. But I was noticing, so because our components, they're completely dependent on the global state, our unit tests, they needed access to the provider. And so something I was always doing was this here. We would make sure our components would have the router, because sometimes it needs the router, and it would have the provider. And that was happening multiple times because a lot of components still completely depend on state. So this was just a cool thing that I think I saw from Richard or just online, was just you can make a wrapper component on your render, and it wraps everything in the provider and the router, so you don't have to do it every single time. And like something we do is we give it sometimes initial state. You can also now do preloaded state. Exactly the same thing. We just make sure there's a preloaded state if we want to make our unit tests care about it. So that's cool because we can like say it's loaded with orders or something. And we've expanded on this already, where not just for the provider, but we might want it to have an initial route, because our filters component and our tables component very much depend on like the URL parameters. So if we have a specific route, our components will render in a certain way. So this is really great because now we no longer have to like do this, the second part, every single time. We just make it very simple like this. So yeah, that's my ramble. I hope that made sense. Thank you. Any questions?
I'll jump in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was a good Yeah, good talk, Phil. I've got two questions. The first one was when you inject in the store into the provider, that's going to be actually accessible to all the routes, right? Or like all the components that you actually put in inside
Yeah,
the
yeah.
provider. But
So everything, all children inside of this provider
yeah,
have access to it if they use selector and use dispatch.
if you put in the store into something like lower level into the child's, would the parents still have access to that? Or
Yeah. So if if your child wants to dispatch an action, update the state, yeah,
yeah,
whenever your child wants to update the state, that's possible with dispatch.
mhm.
Yeah, completely doable.
Okay. The other thing was related to the Thonk API stuff that you mentioned.
Mhm.
With the like extra reduces that you said that you can add, like the pending stuff as you mentioned. I
Mhm.
can think of a few like functions or like few actions that kind of share a similar like the extra. So for like fetch warehouses or like fetch orders that they all kind of need the like pending. You can actually create a like generic. I don't know how to actually explain it. Can we have like generic extra reduces, um, like 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 pending, for example,
Mhm.
that then we could actually use to like extend off. Like I can think of a few actions like fetch warehouses or fetch like other things that they need the like pending.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I think what you're getting at is like just make it more consistent. Like all your
Yeah,
pending extraduces, like they do the same thing. They update the state in the same way. Yeah, they don't
yeah,
they don't need to what you call it. They don't need to do what I'm doing right here every single time where they update directly. This could
hmm,
probably call a function, and that function just needs to state what you call it, and it's just like call pending function, whatever it's called, and that is consistent for each of the pending ones if necessary. You could do that. Yeah, it's very customizable, which is great.
okay. Uh,
Yeah. This is just something great. It's just like this here is our current slice, um, and it's about what 170 lines. Our reducer used to be bigger than that because you had to always do a return a copy. So just the reducers was larger than this slice. Then you also have all your actions, which was much larger as well, and then you have the constant file. So the amount of boilerplate code here is a lot more minimal. It's minimal in comparison. So that's great. But yeah, if you definitely want to get more in depth about it, that's the great thing is Redux Toolkit and Redux obviously have great documentation in comparison to Context API. Actually, it's just in general, they have great documentation. So this has been a godsend and very useful for me just to get through everything. Cool. All right, bye.